They thought he was just another homeless man facing judgment. But when his story unfolded in the silent courtroom, eyes began to glisten. Behind the worn coat and tired eyes lay a history no one could have imagined. A sacrifice buried under decades of silence. And in that moment, the jury forgot the law and remembered their humanity. The courtroom was small. The air inside felt cold. Not because of the air conditioner, but because of the silence. A single beam of pale morning light slipped through the tall window, stretching across the wooden floor until it touched the defendant's chair. And there sat a man who seemed to belong anywhere but here. His hair was silver, uncombed, falling over a weathered face. A coat, frayed at the sleeves, patched at the elbows, hung loosely from his shoulders. The kind of coat that had seen too many winters, and too few kind hands. He sat still, not fidgeting, not pleading, just there, like someone who had grown used to being invisible. On the table in front of him, a public defender flipped through a thin folder. It was so thin, it barely looked like a case at all. The lawyer sighed quietly, not out of anger, but out of the tired familiarity of handling these kinds of cases. No surprise, no excitement, just another day. The charge? Shoplifting. A loaf of bread. A can of soup. Some instant noodles. Nothing worth a headline. Nothing that would ever be remembered, or so it seemed. From the jury box, 12 faces looked on. Their expressions were mild, detached. Some rested their chins on their palms. One man scribbled notes without even looking at the defendant. To them, it was just another petty crime. A homeless man. A stolen meal. Another burden on the system. In the back of the room, a young court clerk glanced at the man, then looked away. The file in her hand told her everything the court thought they needed to know. Name. Date of birth. No fixed address. Unemployed. History of minor offenses, trespassing, loitering, petty theft. There was no mention of anything worth respect. No hint of a life before this one. The bailiff, standing by the wall, adjusted his stance and stole a quick look at the man. He noticed the way the man's hands rested quietly in his lap. Scarred hands. Not the soft palms of someone who'd avoided work, but the calloused, worn skin of someone who had once worked hard and worked long. Still, the room held no sympathy. At least not yet. The judge entered. Everyone rose, then sat. Her gaze swept over the room, settling on the defendant for only a moment before moving on. Routine. Predictable. This case would be over quickly. Mr. Miller. The judge began, her tone neutral. You are charged with theft of food items from Harrison's Market on the evening of May 14th. How do you plead? The man lifted his eyes. They were pale blue, faded with age but not weak. His voice was low, steady, without defiance. Guilty, Your Honor. A few jurors nodded slightly, as if that confirmed what they already believed. The judge scribbled something in her notes. The public defender leaned closer, whispering a few words to the man, but he only shook his head. There was no attempt to deny, no excuses, only acceptance. It should have ended there. A short hearing, a routine sentencing, a few months in county jail. Case closed. But there was something in the way he sat, in the way his gaze held steady without challenge or shame. It wasn't the posture of a man who'd been beaten down by life. It was the posture of someone who had once stood tall and had never truly forgotten how. One juror, an older woman in a green sweater, found herself staring longer than she meant to. There was something familiar about the way he held his shoulders. She couldn't place it. Not yet. From the gallery, the muffled sound of shuffling papers, the occasional cough, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, all filled the gaps between words. The judge glanced down again at the man's file. Just a name. David Miller. Common. Ordinary. Forgettable. If anyone had guessed that this man once carried a rifle in the desert, or stood in the rain waiting for a helicopter that never came, or watched brothers in arms fall around him while he kept moving forward, if anyone had guessed any of that, they would have been wrong. Because nothing in that file, nothing in the room, hinted at the life he had lived before ending up here. And so, as the morning sun crept higher and the shadows in the room began to shift, the trial began. Not knowing that before it ended, no one in that courtroom would see this man the same way again. The judge leaned forward slightly, adjusting her glasses. Her voice was calm, steady, professional. "Mr. Miller," she began, "before we proceed with the charges, I need to understand your circumstances. Where are you living right now?" There was a pause. Not long enough to be uncomfortable, just long enough to make a few people glance up. David Miller sat still, shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of his tattered coat. He kept his eyes lowered. "Nowhere, ma'am," he said finally. His tone was quiet, almost flat. "Wherever I can find a spot." A juror in the back scribbled something on a notepad without looking up. Another shifted in her seat, glancing at the clock. It was the kind of answer they expected: another homeless man, another petty theft case. Routine. Forgettable. The judge's pen tapped lightly on her legal pad. "And your source of income?" she asked. His hands rested on his knees. The fingers trembled slightly, a small, involuntary motion. It wasn't the fidgeting of a nervous man. It was the unsteady tremor of someone who'd lived too long in the cold. "No income," he replied. "No embellishment. No excuses. And have you sought employment?" The judge continued, her voice still neutral. This time, David lifted his eyes. There was no defiance there, no bitterness, only a steady, tired calm. "I tried," he said slowly. Then, after a beat, he added, "But some battles never end." The words hung in the air, not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. Something shifted in the room. It wasn't silence. The fluorescent lights still buzzed faintly overhead, but the space felt different. Several jurors glanced up from their papers. They didn't look away this time. The public defender, who had been half-leaning on the defense table flipping through the thin file, stopped mid-page. His eyes flicked up toward David. "What do you mean by that?" the judge asked. Leaning back slightly, David hesitated. His gaze drifted for a moment, as if to somewhere far away, somewhere only he could see. Before he could answer, the public defender spoke. "Mr. Miller, have you served in the military?" It was subtle, but his entire posture changed. His shoulders straightened. His chin lifted slightly. The fatigue in his eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted, became something else. "Yes," he said. That single word landed heavier than anyone expected. Jurors exchanged quick glances. The woman in the green sweater put down her pen completely. The defender leaned forward. "What branch?" "Marine Corps." A pause. 2 tours overseas. No pride in his tone. No self-pity either. Just fact. From the corner of the room, the bailiff's head turned slightly. In the gallery, someone cleared their throat quietly. "Were you honorably discharged?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor." She wrote something on her pad, but her eyes lingered on him a little longer than before. The jurors were no longer bored. They weren't just watching a homeless man accused of stealing bread and a few items from a grocery store. They were looking at a veteran, a man who had once worn the uniform, carried orders, and stood in places most people in this room would never see. And that changed things. The courtroom no longer felt like it was holding a petty case. It felt heavier, because now, every person was wondering the same thing. How does someone go from serving their country to sitting here, under the cold glare of a courtroom's fluorescent lights? David shifted slightly in his seat. The coat he wore was frayed along the cuffs, the fabric thin from years of wear. His hair was silver at the temples, but uneven, as if cut with a dull pocket knife. There were deep lines in his face, the kind life doesn't put there unless it has been hard for a long time. The public defender set the file down entirely now. The case was still about stolen bread. But the man was not what he first seemed. The judge's next question was softer. "Mr. Miller, when did you serve?" He cleared his throat, as if the memories had dust on them. "First deployment 03, second in 06. A young juror in the front row leaned forward. "Where?" he asked before remembering he wasn't supposed to speak. David glanced at him anyway. Fallujah, he said simply. The young man sat back, eyes wide. The public defender looked around the room. He didn't need to say it out loud, but the thought was there. This wasn't a man who simply drifted into crime. Something had happened between the battlefield and this courtroom. And now, everyone wanted to know what. The judge tapped her pen once more, then said, "Mr. Miller, we'll come back to your service record shortly. For now, let's return to the matter at hand." But no one in the room was really thinking about the bread anymore. They were thinking about the road. The one that began in uniform and somehow ended here. David's voice was low at first, almost hesitant, as if pulling the words from somewhere deep cost him something. "I was infantry," he began. 21 years old when I signed up. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the jury. His eyes were somewhere else. Not in this cramped courtroom, but in another world entirely. "I shipped out for my first deployment over 20 years ago. Desert heat. Endless sky. You could smell the sand in your teeth." The jurors sat still. No one took notes now. Even the bailiff, standing near the wall, had his eyes fixed on the man in the worn coat. "There was a mission," David continued. "We were outnumbered, pinned down. My unit—" He stopped, swallowed. "My unit took heavy fire. Friends I'd trained with, eaten with, they didn't make it home." A faint creak came from the gallery benches as someone shifted, uncomfortable. It wasn't the kind of story people expected to hear in a petty theft trial. "I got hit," he said simply, tapping his side with 2 fingers. Didn't elaborate on the pain. Didn't talk about the blood. Only the facts. "But we had wounded, and I was still breathing, so I pulled them out, one by one. Dragged them through the dirt while the air was screaming." The room was silent except for the hum of the lights. He didn't describe the sound of bullets or the smell of burning. He didn't have to. You could hear it in the way his voice slowed, in the way his eyes fixed on something only he could see. "They told me afterward it was a classified operation," he said almost bitterly. "No medals, no headlines, just a closed file stamped with classified in red." His hands were still trembling. Not from nerves, but from the weight of remembering. "I came home," he said after a moment. But it wasn't really home anymore. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "Every night, I heard the gunfire. Every morning, I saw their faces. The ones I couldn't bring back." A middle-aged juror in the second row shifted, his jaw tightening. A woman in the front row pressed a tissue to her eyes. "They call it PTSD," David continued. "I just called it never sleeping right again." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "It doesn't go away. You think it might. You tell yourself you can bury it deep enough. But then a car backfires, or a door slams, and you're back there, right in it." He exhaled slowly, as if steadying himself. "I tried to work. I did. But some days I couldn't leave the apartment. Some days I couldn't be around people. Employers don't wait for that. And neither did my wife." The words were simple, but they carried a different kind of pain, the kind that doesn't shout but lingers. "She took our daughter and left. I don't blame her." A few seats away, a juror glanced down at her hands, blinking hard. "After that, I just stopped trying to fit in where I didn't belong anymore." He straightened, but not out of pride. More like a man who'd decided to just stand under the weight instead of fighting it. "The years blur," he said softly. "Shelters when I could. Under bridges when I couldn't. I never begged. Just found ways to get through each day." The public defender was no longer flipping through papers. His hands were folded, eyes locked on David, as if the case had shifted into something entirely different. The judge didn't interrupt. She didn't have to. The courtroom was already suspended in a stillness that felt fragile. "I never wanted pity," David said, his voice steady now. "I wasn't looking for help. I just wanted to survive without being a burden." He looked down at his hands. Weathered, scarred as if they were proof of every word. But surviving gets harder when your body's not young anymore. When your knees remember every mile you marched. A long breath filled the space between his sentences. And yeah, he added quietly, one night I took food from a store, bread, couple cans. Not because I wanted to steal, but because I didn't want to die hungry. No one moved. Not even the court reporter's fingers tapped on the keys for a moment. I know the law's the law, David said, finally looking at the judge. But when you've given everything you have, and you're still standing here with nothing, he let the sentence trail off. Several people in the room lowered their eyes. A man in the gallery rubbed at his forehead, his own eyes glassy. The air in the courtroom felt heavier now. This was no longer a story about a stolen loaf of bread. It was about years, decades of service, sacrifice, and the slow, invisible unraveling that followed. David didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. But somehow that made it hit harder. The judge set her pen down and leaned back in her chair. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was respect. Somewhere in that quiet, a thought settled over the jury. Unspoken, but shared. This man had been left behind. And for the first time that morning, the law felt small compared to the weight of what they'd just heard. The room had been still for a long time after David's story. Then, a soft scrape of wood against the floor broke the silence. A man in the gallery, older, with the slow walk of someone carrying both age and memory, rose from his seat. He didn't say a word. He just stepped quietly toward the exit. The door closed behind him. David glanced up once, then lowered his eyes again, not sure what to make of it. Minutes passed. 5, maybe more. The courtroom waited, the air heavy enough to feel. Then, the door opened again. The same man walked back in. But now, in his hands, was a small wooden box. The kind you don't carry unless what's inside matters. He approached the bench slowly. Not toward the judge. Not toward the lawyers. Toward David. When he reached the defense table, he set the box down gently in front of him. No speech. No ceremony. Just a nod. The kind men give each other when words would only get in the way. David's brow furrowed. He opened the lid. Inside lay a tarnished military medal. Its ribbon was faded, the metal dulled by years, but its shape was unmistakable. Beside it, a black and white photograph of a young infantry unit, faces sunburned, grinning, arms slung over each other's shoulders. And there he was, David, 2 decades younger, standing in the front row, his expression already holding that quiet steadiness. The public defender leaned in, eyes scanning the contents. "What is this?" he asked the man. The man cleared his throat. "I've kept it for him," he said quietly. For a long time. There was movement among the jurors now. Slight shifts, heads tilting forward, drawn in. The lawyer reached back into the box and found something else. A folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age. He opened it carefully. It was a letter. The lawyer read the first line, and his voice caught. He cleared it, then began again. Louder this time, so the whole courtroom could hear. "If you ever see him again, know that you owe him your life." The handwriting was strong, deliberate, the kind of script you don't forget. "It's from one of my men," the older man explained. "He wrote it the night before our last mission together. He didn't make it back, but he wanted the world to know what David did for us that day." The lawyer continued reading. "We were trapped, and there was no way out. I thought that was it. Then I saw him charging through fire, pulling us out one at a time. I don't know how he made it through alive, but if you're hearing this, it means I didn't. So do me one favor. Tell him thank you. Tell him he's the reason I had a few more hours to remember my family's faces." By now, the room had changed. This was no longer a courtroom bound by the rigid edges of procedure. It was something quieter, more human. A juror in the back row dabbed at her eyes. Another shifted his glasses, blinking hard. David sat motionless, staring at the letter. His hands, the same hands that once dragged men through dirt and gunfire, now rested lightly on the table, as if afraid to crease the fragile paper. The judge hadn't moved for a long time. Her chin rested on one hand, eyes fixed on David, and when the reading ended, she removed her glasses. She leaned back in her chair. The pause stretched, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew nothing she said could carry the same weight as what they'd just heard. The public defender set the letter down gently in front of David. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. David's voice was almost a whisper. "Yeah, that's Mark." He was 22. The older man who had brought the box finally spoke again. "Mark was my son." A ripple went through the room. The father's voice stayed steady, but his eyes shone. "For years I kept that letter. For years I wondered if I'd ever get to put it in the hands it belonged to. Today, I can." David's mouth moved as if to speak, but no sound came out. He only nodded, a small, sharp motion, and closed the box again, his fingertips lingering on the lid. In the jury box, no one hid their emotions now. Tears were wiped without shame. Some stared at David as if seeing him for the first time, not as a defendant, but as a man who had once carried more than his own life through a storm. The judge sat forward, setting her glasses down beside her gavel. Her voice, when it came, was calm, but there was something in it, something you don't often hear from the bench. "Mr. Miller," she said, "there are moments in a courtroom when the facts of the case are only part of the truth. This is one of those moments." David met her gaze. Neither of them looked away. The medal stayed on the table, catching the light. The photograph lay beside it, faces frozen in a time before the weight of the years. And the letter seemed to speak even in silence. For a long time, no one moved, and in that pause something shifted, not in the law but in the people who upheld it. Because now, they knew. And knowing changes everything. The judge removed his glasses, voice firm. "All charges dropped. You'll have housing, medical care, and support." For a heartbeat, silence. Then slow, steady applause. Everyone stood. The veteran bowed slightly, gripping the wooden box with the medal and photo. His lawyer leaned in, whispering, "You're not forgotten anymore." Outside, sunlight touched his face. The wind tugged at his tattered coat. His steps were slow, but steady. Each one carried a quiet victory. The room was utterly still. Even the hum of the ceiling fan seemed distant, muffled, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The judge sat back in his chair, hands folded for a moment as his eyes lingered on the man before him. Then, slowly, he removed his glasses, set them down on the bench, and straightened his posture. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was a depth in it, something the courtroom had not heard all day. "All charges dismissed." A ripple moved through the room. The veteran's head jerked up slightly, as if unsure he'd heard correctly. "You will receive full medical care," the judge continued, "housing, and the support you deserve. This is not charity. This is a debt, long overdue." For one breath, the words just hung there. The veteran didn't move. No one did. Then, from somewhere in the back came a single clap, followed by another, and another, slow, deliberate, until the sound filled the space, not rushed, not loud, but steady, certain, and united. The jury rose to their feet. Members of the gallery followed. Even the bailiff, stone-faced all morning, lifted his chin and joined in. The old soldier's eyes glistened. He didn't smile. Not quite. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, one hand resting over the small wooden box he now held. The one with the tarnished medal, the faded photograph, and the letter from a brother in arms who never came home. Beside him, his public defender leaned in. The man's voice was low, but the words cut through the noise. "You're not forgotten anymore." The veteran swallowed hard. His fingers traced the grooves in the box's surface, worn smooth from years of being carried, hidden, and guarded. For 2 decades, it had been a relic of a past no one wanted to hear about. Today it was proof. He turned slowly, walking down the narrow aisle. People stepped back, making space. Some nodded. Others placed a hand over their heart. A few reached out, not to stop him, but just to touch his shoulder as he passed, as if to silently say thank you. At the door he paused. The sunlight beyond spilled into the dim courtroom like a promise. He stepped into it. The city outside was alive. Cars rolling by, voices carrying down the sidewalk, the smell of fresh coffee from the corner cafe. He hadn't noticed such things in years. Now every detail felt sharper. The wind caught his coat. The same tattered, frayed thing he'd worn into the courtroom that morning. It fluttered against his legs, but no longer weighed him down. He didn't rush. His steps were slow, deliberate, steady. Not the shuffle of a man beaten down by the streets, but the stride of someone who had just reclaimed a piece of himself. A bus rumbled past. The driver glanced out the window, then gave a small nod, a silent salute. The veteran kept walking. Every step took him farther from the cold bench in the defendant's seat, and closer to a life that, for the first time in decades, felt possible. Somewhere in the city, there were still shelters that smelled of damp clothes, streets where the cold bit through every layer, corners where shadows clung. He had known them well. He might pass them again, but he wouldn't be staying. Behind him, in that little courtroom, the people who had stood for him were settling back into their seats. They would go home tonight with a story they'd carry for the rest of their lives, about a man they thought was just another case, and learned was a hero walking in plain sight. You're not forgotten anymore. He took a deep breath. The air felt different, lighter, and as he reached the corner, he didn't look back. Not because he was leaving the past behind entirely, but because he was finally stepping into a future that might just hold something worth walking toward. If the story touched you, share it, because somewhere out there, another hero is still walking among us, unseen, waiting to be remembered.